Good day. As I make this programme on 15th October, news continues to be dominated by the events in Palestine, in Israel, in what some call the Palestinian territories, in Gaza. Yesterday, for much of the day, there were lots of reports, lots of suggestions that today would start the Israeli ground offensive into northern Gaza. Well, it does seem as if Israeli special forces have, to some extent, been operating inside Gaza, but a full-scale, outright ground invasion has not yet taken place. Now, there's been much discussion and speculation about why this might be the case. There's been those calls for restraint from the United Nations, from the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, from UN humanitarian agencies. There's concern on the part of those agencies about the practicality of Israel's demand that 1.2 million people evacuate from northern Gaza to the south. It's also the case that Egypt, for the reasons I've discussed, continues to resist pressure from Israel and apparently also from the United States to open the crossing points into Egypt from Gaza. I saw a report yesterday that the Egyptian authorities did open one crossing point for a few hours, but I understand that this was done principally to allow humanitarian relief supplies to enter Gaza, not to allow a mass of refugees to leave Gaza, to leave the area controlled, the area of Gaza, which is now the subject of all this, of the current war. Now, as I've discussed already, in many places, it is all but inconceivable, to my mind, that the Egyptian government would agree or would willingly agree to a mass exodus of people from Gaza into Sinai, proposal supposedly made by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the then Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak more than a decade ago. I would point out that there has never been independent corroboration of that conversation, which has been reported apparently from Egyptian sources, but which we've never seen independent corroboration of. But there is no possibility, one way or the other, that the Egyptians would allow anything like that to happen. Doing so would almost certainly destabilize the political situation in Egypt, and, by the way, the economic situation there, which, as always, remains precarious, with a government, a military-backed government, which came to power as a result of a coup against a president, a civilian president, elected by the Egyptian population, but supported by and a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, the same organization with which Hamas has connections. So, for those reasons alone, the Egyptian government would not want to allow millions of refugees from Gaza to stream into Egypt in that kind of way. It would create an enormous security problem for the Egyptian authorities, one which probably they would struggle to get on top of and might not be able to get on top of. And of course, it would massively destabilize the economic situation in Egypt, which is extremely fragile. But beyond that, there is the concern, shared undoubtedly by Egypt, which is, of course, an Arab country led by an Arab government, a secular Arab government. Cairo, of course, is the place where the Arab League has its headquarters. There is a concern in Egypt. There is a concern in Gaza and across Palestine or the Palestinian territories. There is a concern across the Arab world, and there is a concern, of course, across the larger Muslim world, that in the event that millions of Palestinian refugees were to stream out of Gaza into Sinai, it is all but inconceivable that Israel would ever allow them back, in which case a further territory which once formed part of the British Mandate of Palestine would fall under Israeli control and would be denuded, cleansed of its Arab population. So for that reason, the Egyptian government is resisting this pressure, and apparently, I haven't seen this, but apparently there's been a great deal of criticism in the Israeli media of the Egyptian government's decisions, but they are understandable and they are predictable. But anyway, so far, as I said, there's been no Israeli offensive into Gaza. There's been massive criticism of the humanitarian effect of some of the Israeli demands. I understand that UN humanitarian agencies are also saying that Israeli demands that hospitals located in northern Gaza be relocated to the south or be removed from northern Gaza, that too would create a humanitarian catastrophe in northern Gaza, that it would deny the people there of possible hospital and medical treatment, which of course is especially important, especially serious at a time, especially needed at a time of armed conflict. So anyway, it could be that it is these calls for restraint from the United Nations, which are now backed by some Western governments, including to some extent, at least, apparently, by the United States. It could be that that is a restraining factor for Israel. Or it could be threats that are now starting to come in from other parts of the Islamic world. There was a report circulating yesterday in Axios, the American magazine. It's probably true, in fact, it's most likely true, that the Iranian government has sent a warning to Israel that if there is an Israeli ground offensive into Gaza, then Iran will be obliged to react, that Iran does not want to get drawn into a conflict at this time, but if there is an attack on Gaza, Iran will have no choice. And perhaps in order to back this warning, there have been reports this morning of missile strikes and military actions by the Hezbollah movement into northern Israel. And perhaps, as I said, that is consequent upon that warning. Though I have to say that in this extremely tense situation, in a situation where Gaza continues to be bombed, one gets the sense that it's going to be difficult anyway, whilst the military crisis continues for the outsiders, the outside powers, Iran, Syria, and others, to avoid becoming drawn in if there is an outright, out-and-out war in Gaza, as would be likely to happen in the event of an Israeli ground invasion. So it could be that that is a further reason why Israel is holding back. But I think there might also be a third reason, and that is that I am not sure that Israel is ready yet for a ground invasion of the sort that has been spoken about. The Israeli army is a mobilization army. There's said to be between 30 and 40,000 fighters in Hamas fighters in Gaza. It's said that these are deeply embedded in a network of tunnels and bunkers. some of which, by the way, apparently, allegedly, date back to the time when Gaza was controlled by Israel and might even have been built by the Israeli military itself at the time in order to perhaps protect its positions in the event of an Egyptian attack, this obviously being the case before the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which took place in 1978. Anyway, I'm not familiar with the history of the fortifications and tunnels and bunkers in Gaza. I'm not even sure of their scale or the extent to which they exist, but virtually everybody does assume that they do exist, and I think it is overwhelmingly likely that they do, and that they're probably as elaborate as people say. But anyway, it could be that Israel is not yet ready for that kind of ground offensive. It needs to mobilize its forces, call up reservists, train those reservists, sort out its equipment and military issues. And of course, here I have received some comments about this. People have pointed out that Israel does produce its own 155mm shells, and of course it does. And I've always known that, and I think I mentioned that in a previous video. But of course, the fact remains that the United States, in order to support Ukraine, pulled out 300,000 shells from Israel. These supposedly were American, but they were intended to be made available to Israel in a period of crisis. I don't know where that leaves Israel's arsenal of shells. And of course, in terms of production of shells, maintaining production of shells, I've no doubt that Israel has the industrial facilities and the technicians to produce shells. But producing shells in vast volumes is something that requires not just enormous factory space, it also requires unrestricted access to raw materials, to steel, to the various chemicals that make up explosives. It requires large numbers of skilled workers to assemble these shells. I have to say, I find it difficult to believe that a country, small country, relatively small country, like Israel, has those sort of resources, such as would be needed to sustain a long war. Now, saying all of that, I also understand that Israel would probably want to make up for any shortage of shells, or would make up for any shortage of shells, by relying on bombing by its air force. And here perhaps I'm going to return to a topic I discussed at the start of my program yesterday. I expressed incredulity that Israel could be dropping on Gaza 1,000 precision-guided bombs a day. And of course, many people have come forward and they've said that yes, Israel does use large numbers of guided bombs in its aerial campaign, but that it is also using straightforward old-style iron bombs that are not guided, that they're dropping heavily on Gaza, and that, of course, it is these bombs that make up the numbers. And, of course, again, I've no reason to doubt that that is indeed the case, but, of course, using unguided bombs, that might make a huge amount of military and logistical sense. These bombs exist in vast numbers, both in Israel's own arsenals and in those of the United States. Well, that may make a great deal of sense, but of course it makes it more difficult to choose targets precisely. In turn, is likely to increase the level of destruction and devastation and death in Gaza, which of course is going to, in time, over time, increase political pressure on Israel and on the United States to agree to a ceasefire, precisely as discussed in my previous programs. Now, having said that, coming back to what I said, it seems to me that it is entirely plausible that the Israelis need more time to get their forces together and ready to develop a proper plan for attacking Hamas in Gaza and for seeing exactly how this operation can be carried out. Latest reports say that the attack has been delayed until sometime next week, so we might be still a few days away from that point, and it's being attributed to difficult weather conditions. I find that a difficult explanation to accept, by the way, in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean region, which of course I know. I'm not saying that the weather can't cause problems, but this is not analogous to the kind of problems the weather might cause in, say, southern Ukraine during the season of the Rus-Turkey. So I think this looks more like an excuse than a true reason for a postponement of this operation. Anyway, suffice to say that given that there is a postponement of this operation, this military operation, that is giving more time and space for others to start taking steps to both establish their positions, their political and positions, just to lay down markers for the future course of diplomatic and political activity with respect to this conflict, and also perhaps to leverage this conflict for their own advantage. Now, John Helmer, invaluable and essential writer as he is on Russian affairs, has said that there is now discussion between Moscow and Ankara about the dispatch of a Turkish convoy carrying food and medical supplies to Gaza, escorted by the Russian Navy, and to some extent at least protected by the Russian Air Force, operating from Russia's Khmeimim air base in northern Syria. Now, I don't know whether these discussions are underway, but Helmer is a very well-informed journalist, and he may be right about this. But of course, if such a thing happens, it's difficult to see how that might not complicate Israeli decision-making even further, but it will bring the Russians and the Turks closer together at a time when, throughout this year, relations between them have not always been entirely easy. And of course, and beyond that, it will also have a big impact internationally, in the Muslim world, in the global south, in places where the Palestinian cause attracts a great deal of sympathy. So that is one thing it is likely to do. It is also a powerful way of demonstrating to Israel and to the United States and the West that Russia is back in the game. The Russians have essentially been out of the game in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, since the early 1980s. They were sidelined in the 1970s, when Egypt, their former ally, switched sides under President Sadat and went over to the side of the United States, supplied large amounts of weapons, by the way, to the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan, who were at that time in the late 1970s and early 1980s fighting the Soviets there. And of course, in 1978, Egypt, to Soviet dismay, agreed a unilateral treaty with Israel, a peace treaty with Israel, which buried the Geneva Conference, co-chaired by the United States and by the Soviet Union, that was going to be the vehicle through which a diplomatic settlement of the Middle East crisis was supposed to be pursued. After the President Sadat's peace initiative, his visit to Jerusalem to Israel in 1977, his visit to the Knesset at that time, his peace treaty with Israel, Geneva lost its purpose, and we never heard about it again. And that was a very heavy blow for Soviet influence, for Russian influence in the Middle East. The Soviets, however, did retain a certain amount of influence, and they were able to leverage it successfully during the 1982 crisis, when Israel advanced into southern Lebanon in an operation called, by the way, Peace for Galilee. Israel was seeking to defeat the Palestinian Liberation Organization that had established itself in southern Lebanon and in Beirut. And this led to a major military conflict in which the Soviets backed Syria, which at that time was supporting not so much the PLO, with which the Syrian government of that time, led by President Hafez al-Assad, father of Bashar al-Assad. Anyway, the Syrian government of that time, had a bad relationship with the PLO. But anyway, Syria did play a significant role in that crisis. After the PLO withdrew, and the Israelis found themselves in conflict with various Shia movements in southern Lebanon, which ultimately coalesced into the organization we know today as Hezbollah. Anyway, the Soviets were there backing the Syrians, supplying the Syrians with military equipment and training and supplies and a certain degree of economic assistance. And as Israel found the situation in Lebanon increasingly difficult, and as the United States suffered severe blows, including a suicide bomb attack on Marines, US Marines in Lebanon, who'd been sent to Lebanon purportedly as part of a peacekeeping force. Anyway, as all of those events took place, there was perhaps a certain ephemeral uptick in Soviet influence. But then events in the Soviet Union itself began to take its course. Mikhail Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union in 1985. He embarked on a program of perestroika. The Soviet Union found it impossible to reform itself in the way that Gorbachev intended, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And thereafter, the Soviet Union and then Russia ceased to be a significant force in Middle Eastern affairs. This until the Russians in 2015 intervened militarily in Syria and rescued Bashar al-Assad's government from the various jihadi fighters who were fighting against it. But though that intervention by the Russians in 2015 and the presence of Russian troops in Syria thereafter represented a military return by the Russians to the Middle East. It did not represent a return of the Russians into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Russians were extremely careful to make it clear to the Israelis that their presence in Syria was in no way hostile, directed at Israel itself. The Russians, for example, took no action to prevent Israel from continuing bombing raids into Syria against alleged Iranian targets there. So, in effect, the Russians continued to absent themselves from playing any kind of role in the Palestinian-Israeli, Arab-Israeli crisis. If the Russians now do escort Turkish ships carrying food and other supplies to Israel, then they will have returned, and will have returned with a vengeance. And it will be an immensely important, very powerful moment in the modern history of the Middle East. But of course, that hasn't happened yet, and we'll see whether it does happen. I would have thought that if rumours of this spread, there will be lots of anxious words addressed, especially to Erdogan in Ankara, lots of demands and warnings from Western officials, and indeed the Israelis as well, not to go down this route. And I personally would not be surprised if there were also threats that there might be military actions taken against those Russian warships and against those Turkish ships, if they were indeed to steve in convoy towards Gaza. We'll just have to wait and see what this happens. It's a strange, tantalizing possibility that something like this might take place, but it hasn't yet happened. I suspect that discussions of this kind are underway. We don't know yet whether they will crystallize and amount to anything. But even if the Russians are not yet committing themselves to escorting Turkish cargo ships steaming to Gaza, they are apparently taking other steps. Now, there's been many rumours, many reports about a Russian proposal for a ceasefire resolution that the Russians are said to be working on, and which they are apparently intending to present to the UN Security Council. I've discussed in recent programs how there has been frenetic diplomatic activity, barely noticed in the West, but involving Russia, Iran, China, which weighed in a spectacular way yesterday by the comments of the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, which I discussed in my previous program, by also the governments of either existing BRICS countries or future BRICS countries like Egypt, for example, and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia having undertaken discussions with each other, including at the highest level. Anyway, there's been intense diplomatic activity, and all of that, as I suggested, points very much towards some kind of Russian-backed, BRICS-backed peace proposal, ceasefire proposal, discussed extensively in various comments now by President Putin, which I have discussed in several videos, and as I said, now forcefully backed by the Chinese. So there are reports that the Russians are working on this proposed resolution, and it is likely that when it is proposed to the Security Council, which now looks certain, it will come with the support of many countries, of China, of the other BRICS states, of most of the global south, and of course of the key institutions, the key regional institutions. The Arab League, which, as I said, is headquartered in Egypt, the Islamic Conference, and of course the African Union. Many overlook the fact that several Arab states, including Egypt, are also members of the African Union. So this ceasefire resolution could be proposed to the Security Council, perhaps over the next few days, and of course it will be an embarrassment to the United States. Hamas has already indicated that they would be prepared to abide by such a resolution that they in effect supported. Why would they not? And Israel, which is looking at the moment to start some kind of military campaign in Gaza, is certain to be unhappy about it, and so will the United States and the other Western powers. The US, for the last 2 years, ever since the Ukrainian crisis really began to gather steam, and of course especially since February 2022, the United States has been working overtime to try to isolate Russia internationally. It has been entirely unsuccessful in doing so up to this point. But a resolution proposed by Russia to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, and commanding global support over a conflict like the one that is currently taking place in the Middle East, will expose in the most spectacular way the extent of the US's failure, of its failure to isolate Russia. So the US will be deeply unhappy about a Russian proposal to a Russian proposed resolution. They will not want to veto it because they do not want a situation in which it appears that the Russians stand for global opinion and the United States and the West are in a minority, but neither will they want to accept it because, of course, if they accept a Russian proposed and Russian drafted resolution, then, of course, the United States will be seen to be following where Moscow has led, and that would be an incredibly difficult and embarrassing thing for the Biden administration to do, given all that it has been saying about Russia and about President Putin over the last 2 years. So, the US and the Western powers will now be using every procedural trick they can, every point of pressure that is available to them to try to persuade non-aligned countries in the Security Council against supporting this resolution, trying to prevent the resolution in the Security Council getting the necessary 9 votes that would oblige a veto. They will in fact attempt to prevent the resolution being presented to the Security Council for a vote at all. And given the enormous influence that the United States still has, and the tremendous power that it still has, and given the structural majority that the United States has long enjoyed in the Security Council, it might even succeed in doing that. But nonetheless, across much of the world, amongst Arab officials and diplomats, to some extent at least amongst the Arab public and amongst the public in the Muslim world, these moves in the Security Council to block a resolution calling for a ceasefire and an end to hostilities, one which, as I said, Hamas has spoken in support of, well, it's not going to go down well. But I said that the Russians, anyway, will be wanting to put down a marker. This will be the first, I suspect, in a series of such draft resolutions that the Russians and others will be putting before the Security Council. There will be others coming eventually from the BRICS states, perhaps from the Arab League, perhaps from other countries. Pressure will steadily grow the longer this crisis continues, and sooner or later it will become impossible to avoid putting a resolution like this to the vote. And if that does indeed happen, the pressure on some countries normally aligned with the United States to support the resolution will become intense. So that's where we are with the diplomatic moves. Now, in saying all of this, I want to make a number of points about Hamas absolutely clear. I have seen that over the last couple of days, Hamas has been trying to distance itself from some of the ghastly atrocities committed by Hamas fighters over the course of that raid deep into Israel. There's been a lot of stories and claims made about what actually took place. There was a story about children and babies being beheaded, which I understand is now discredited. But the reality of what happened is appalling enough. There is no doubt at all that Hamas fighters deliberately fired upon young people attending a music festival. They stormed various kibbutzim in this area. Civilians were killed, and often in horrible ways. And in any event, it's clear that appalling acts, terrorist acts, were committed. Now, over the last couple of days, Hamas has started to distance itself from these acts. They say that their claim is that they had not apparently expected Israeli defenses to be as weak as they were, that they lost control of their own fighters as those fighters found themselves in the kibbutzim, in all of these places, that it was not Hamas's intention to carry out these atrocities, and that this was all a ghastly and terrible mistake and a tragedy, and one for which, well, Hamas might be responsible, but which was not intended. Now, I don't know what Hamas was planning, but I'm going to say straightforwardly that I don't actually believe these claims. Now, I say that, as I said, let me stress again, I am not party to Hamas's own internal discussions. But my sense is that the fighters who carried out this raid deep into Israel were amongst the most highly trained and most motivated fighters that Hamas has, equivalent, if you like, to Hamas's own special forces. Most of them would have been aware that they were on a one-way suicide mission, given the overwhelming power of the Israeli military. And I think that most probably these fighters, like trained fighters in most places, would have been highly disciplined and would have been amenable to orders. If they did carry out this orgy of killing, which they clearly did, then either no orders were given to them to tell them not to do this thing, or, and I have to say, I think this more likely, there was actually an intention by Hamas to inflict civilian casualties. And of course, Hamas has a history of this. It tends to be forgotten, but at one time, Hamas was launching suicide bombers into Israel, and some of those bombers, suffice to say, were not averse to carrying out spectacular attacks which involved civilian casualties within Israel. So it's not as if Hamas does not have a history of carrying out these attacks. I think, and this is my own view, and I know some people will passionately disagree, but I think Hamas always intended that there should be civilian casualties. Just as I think Hamas always intended that hundreds of people would be taken prisoner and taken to Israel, to Gaza, as hostages. I think Hamas, which is an organization whose level of agency, its ability to make its own decisions, as I have said before, should not be underestimated. I think that they deliberately acted in a way which they knew would provoke a massive Israeli reaction. And I think all the things that we are seeing now, all of the crisis that we see in Gaza, the Israeli bombing, the talk of an Israeli ground offensive into Gaza, the Israeli demands for the displacement of the people of northern Gaza, for the closing down of the hospitals there. Well, perhaps Hamas did not anticipate them all, but I suspect that Hamas knew perfectly well that there would be a massive Israeli response, and I think that it has deliberately engineered one. And I think it has done that because it knows that by doing this, it places itself at center stage in the larger Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and it knows also that Israel would take and would feel obliged to take steps which would provoke strong feelings against Israel across the Arab and Muslim world. Now, I make all of these points, all these observations, because I'm aware of the fact that there are many, many people in Israel who are shocked and angry and deeply upset, and also, I have to say, very frightened about these things. And it's not just in Israel. There was a remarkable piece in the Financial Times by the historian Simon Sharma, who says that this is not a moment to analyze or contextualize He rejects all of that entirely. He talks instead about this attack on people in southern Israel in the context, he places it in the context of centuries of violence against Jewish people in Europe and in the Middle East. And he, of course, gives a long list of these incidents, these terrible incidents, which have indeed happened in the past. I understand all of that, but I also have to say that it looks to me that Hamas, which, as I said, whatever it may be, comes across to me as an intelligent organization, and ruthlessness and intelligence are, of course, by no means mutually exclusive. I think that Hamas knew perfectly well that these kind of feelings would be aroused. And I have to say to people who have these feelings and who let themselves be guided by these feelings, that it looks to me that they're discounting the possibility that through these feelings they're being manipulated. This is not, after all, something new. And coming back to Simon Sharma's article, written by a historian, I would suggest again that at a moment like this, analysing and understanding what is happening and trying to decide on steps based on calculation and reason is even more important than it is at any other time. This is a moment that calls for maximum discipline, and for the moment, I have to say that I see little sign of that. Anyway, I've just wanted to make that point because I think it is an important one, and it is essential to understand it in the context of what is happening now. Anyway, one way or the other, we will see what happens. I'm not myself wholly convinced that there will be this elaborate Russian-Turkish relief operation. Though let me say again, Helmer almost certainly is picking up actual information that this is indeed being prepared and it cannot be excluded. But of course, it would perhaps suit the Russians especially to circulate ideas that it is coming, because of course that increases the pressure on the Americans and on the Israelis and others about diplomatic initiatives, some of which for the moment are coming principally from Moscow, but which will soon be joined in from other places. Well, that, it seems to me, is now clear. And unless the Israelis, and the Americans most of all, are careful, they could find that the diplomatic initiative is wrested from their hands. And if Israel does eventually find itself bogged down in a military operation in Gaza, which will result in many lives being lost, Israeli lives, lives of Israeli soldiers, and also, and beyond that, hundreds, thousands of civilians, and may I say again, an organization like Hamas, prepared to sacrifice the lives of its fighters and carry out actions of the sort that I have described, is probably not an organization that is going to balk at pursuing its objectives, because hundreds of civilians on its own side also might lose their lives. That's what I think. Again, I'm sure I will get pushback from that. But anyway, given that that is so, given those potential events, as I said, the real possibility that as the fighting continues, as the days and the weeks pass with no clear-cut outcome, as criticism grows around the world, and by the way, I have seen some opinion polling from the United States, formally rock solid in support of Israel, but I noticed that support for Israel there seems to have dimmed, apparently. 53% of Americans now support Israel or sympathize with Israel. 31% of Americans now express sympathies for the Palestinians. There's an article in the Financial Times which says that the Jewish community in the United States has been dismayed to find that the left of the Democratic Party, or some members on the left of the Democratic Party, including in Congress, are now also starting, ever so cautiously, to express sympathy for Israel. Well, over time, as this conflict continues, that pressure will grow. And as I said, the diplomatic initiative could be wrested out of the US's hands and Israel's hands. And eventually, the pressure in Europe, in the United States, from around the world, might increase to the point where a diplomatic process is set in train, a ceasefire is proposed, which the Americans find impossible to resist anymore, and which in Israel is perceived as a defeat for Israel itself. So, and which, by the way, by extension, Hamas might be able to represent as a victory. That danger exists, and as I said, it is extremely important for the Israelis, for the humanitarian reasons I've discussed extensively in previous programs, which will have consequences for Israel too, if they are disregarded, but also for straightforward reasons of political self-interest. It is extremely important now that Israel itself makes decisions that are carefully thought through and are not driven by pure political self-interest on the part of certain politicians and by emotion. Anyway, I've said various things over this program. I'm sure, as always happens in this kind of conflict, in this particular conflict, some of the things that I've said will displease people. As I said, there is intense anger on both sides, which is growing. But I think it's only proper if I say what I think. Otherwise, why make programs like this at all? And as I said, I think that what Israel needs to do is to stop and think. No doubt some kind of military response is essential, if only for Israel's own domestic political needs, which can never be disregarded, but it needs to be a response that is carefully calibrated in order to sustain support around the world, and it needs also to be a response that leaves open the route to a political resolution of this problem, which is the only way, in the end, that Israel and its people can achieve that security which they crave. Anyway, that's where we are today. We will see what happens. We will see whether this Russian-Turkish plan materializes, and we will see where all this goes. In the meantime, let us now go back to that other conflict, the conflict in Ukraine. And there's been a great deal of news now coming out from there. And to a certain degree, it's going to require, or should require, deeper analysis and discussion that I'm going to be able to provide in today's program. But nonetheless, I will cover it, even though perhaps in a less in-depth way than I would like. Firstly, President Putin has now spoken about the state of Ukraine's offensive. I say spoken, but he's not done so publicly. He's done so in a meeting with a journalist, Pavel Zarubin, and apparently this is a television interview which is going to be published in the program Moscow, Kremlin, Putin, but it hasn't been published yet, and I have no access to it. And for reasons, by the way, which are unknown to me, the Kremlin, at least in its English language website, tends not to provide transcripts of what Putin says over the course of interviews that he gives on this regular television show. But anyway, according to Pavel Zarubin, who was the journalist who interviewed him, Putin had this to say about Ukraine's counteroffensive. As for the counteroffensive, which has allegedly been stalled, it has failed completely. We know that in certain areas of combat operations, the opposing side is nevertheless preparing new active offensive operations. We see this, and we know about it, and we are also reacting accordingly. So what Putin is saying, what he said to Zarubin, is that the Ukrainian offensive has failed. It is not to be excluded that the Ukrainians might still try and do something over the course of the next couple of weeks. But the Russians have a pretty shrewd idea what that might be, and they've taken steps to prepare for it. And obviously what Putin is hinting at is this last throw that the Ukrainians might carry out, which is this attempt to launch an armed crossing of the Dnieper from western Kherson region, controlled by Ukraine, into eastern Kherson region. There have been lots of discussions about this, and also perhaps conceivably another Ukrainian attempt to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Ukraine's intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, has admitted that 3 unsuccessful attempts by Ukraine have previously been made. President Zelensky recently promised the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mr. Grossi, that Ukraine would not be making any further such attempts. I think no one should place any reliance upon that assurance. It's possible that such attempts might continue to be made. But Putin says that whatever it is that the Ukrainians are planning, the Russians know what it is. They're taking the necessary steps to guard and prepare against it. And in light of that, he clearly is confident that whatever it is that the Ukrainians might be thinking of doing, that it will fail. And Putin also says that in every other respect, the offensive has failed. And in fact, we are now seeing admissions to this effect in the Ukrainian social media space. Increasing numbers of Ukrainian commentators are now grudgingly admitting that the offensive has come to an end, that it didn't achieve any of its objectives, and that Ukraine is now going to have no choice before long but to go over to the defensive. And in fact, I saw one social media post by a Ukrainian commentator, someone who says that they're the voice of the Ukrainian armed forces. I'm sure that's not true, by the way. But apparently this person said that Ukraine would have no choice but to remain on the defensive for at least a year. Ukrainian losses have been so heavy, Ukrainian casualties have been so high, so much equipment has been lost, so much artillery has been, ammunition has been depleted, that it is simply not possible now for Ukraine to conduct offensive operations for the time being. And the initiative, therefore, has now decisively passed to the Russians. And indeed, we have been hearing more and more reports over the course of the last 24 hours about the Russians taking the initiative in all sorts of places. There's reports now that the Russians are counterattacking in a much more serious way than up to now in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector of the front lines. Again, details are very sketchy, but that's what is said. They've been making progress also for some time in the Vremevka salient area and in the Bakhmut area. The Russians continue these movements around Kupiansk. There's yet another report, there have been several reports of this nature up to this point, but there are reports which appeared yesterday, but which have been repeated today, that the Ukrainians have been finally and conclusively pushed out of Sinkovka, this village on the Sivkovka ledge near to Kupiansk. General Syrsky, the Ukrainian ground forces commander, says that the Russians are aiming to surround Ukrainian troops in the Kupiansk area, with pushing the Ukrainians, encircling the Ukrainians, with the Ukrainians back against the Oskol River, over which the Russians have destroyed the bridges. So that's coming now from General Syrsky himself, and that he's clearly talking about some kind of an operational crisis emerging there. And it's clear that a lot is going on here, especially with the commitment of the new 25th Combined Arms Army that the Russians have deployed in this sector. And there's also many more reports from Avdiivka, though, as is often the way, these reports are contradictory. So there was a report early this morning, that the shelling and bombing of Avdiivka has abated, which some saw as an admission that the Russians' advance towards Avdiivka has come to a stop. And then a short time later, there was an entirely different report which said that the bombing and the shelling of Avdiivka, on the contrary, has intensified. And yesterday, there were reports that the Russians had pulled back from the Slab Keep that they captured a few days ago, and that it was now in the grey zone. Then there were further reports to the effect that the Russians, in fact, were back in control of the slag heap or had never lost control over it. And perhaps more importantly, there are also reports that the Russians are now very close to the railway line through which Ukraine sends supplies into Avdiivka. And in fact, there have been many pictures and films of a train, or more than one train, Ukrainian train, trying to reach Avdiivka, presumably with supplies and reinforcements, being attacked by the Russian military and destroyed in some way. And there's also reports of the Russians closing in, getting closer, edging closer to the one main road still left through which the Ukrainians are also able to send supplies into Avdiivka. Now, all of these reports are uncorroborated, and they're not, by the way, confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. It never confirms reports of this nature. So one can't know how accurate or not they are. But for the record, I suspect that they are fairly accurate. I think that the Russians, as I've said previously, are not looking to storm Avdiivka in some great coup de main. They know perfectly well that Avdiivka is heavily fortified, that the Ukrainians have built elaborate defences there. They've had 9 years to do it, and that it will be an incredibly costly and very difficult operation to try to storm and capture this heavily fortified town. But it does seem as if the vice around Avdiivka is indeed closing, and that the Russians are working towards establishing a cauldron there. But then, of course, the other possibility that the Russians might do in Avdiivka, on a smaller scale, what they did in Bakhmut, appear to be closing the vice around Avdiivka, but in fact allowing a gap to remain through which the Ukrainians continue to send reinforcements and supplies, weakening their overall strategic reserves, losing more and more men, more and more casualties, depleting their ammunition and equipment stocks. In other words, that the Russians might be simply using Avdiivka, this battle in Avdiivka, to continue this process of attrition that they have been conducting since the summer of last year. Well, that possibility, it seems to me, cannot be discounted at all. And going back to that interview that Putin gave with Pavel Zarubin on that program, Moscow, Kremlin, Putin, apparently over the course of that program, Putin went out of his way to say that Russian advances, which are now, he admitted, taking place all across the front line, are for the moment of a purely tactical nature. Overall, the Russian stance remains a defensive one. So, supposedly he said, and that the Russians clearly are still conserving and building up their forces for whatever is to come. Now, as I said, trying to work out Russian intentions is complex and difficult process. The Ukrainians telegraph their intentions weeks and months in advance. As I discussed in many programs in the past, the Kherson offensive that took place last year was something that the Ukrainians were talking about. Well, it happened at the end of August, but the Ukrainians first started talking about it in March 2022, as I well remember. The Zaporozhye offensive towards the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov. First time I saw comments about it in Slavyangrad was in the autumn, the mid-autumn of 2022. Of course, it only actually happened in June 2023. Mikhailo Podolyak, Zelensky's advisor, has admitted that the Ukrainians are 9 months behind schedule in pretty much everything they do. But as I said, they've been telegraphing their intentions continuously. Putin has already made it pretty clear that the Russians are aware of what the last attempts that the Ukrainians are going to make, the last flickers of attempts that the Ukrainians are planning in terms of an offensive, what they are. So the Russians, the world in fact, knows most of what Ukraine is planning at any one particular juncture or point in time, whereas the Russians, by contrast, have shown extraordinary skill in keeping us all guessing about what they're going to do. They are able to maintain and continue to maintain silence. So we will have to wait and see. But again, my own sense, and it tends to be supported by what Putin is saying, is that for the moment at least, the Russians are not going to conduct any big arrow offensives. They're still thinning and stretching the Ukrainian lines. They're still conducting attrition against the Ukrainians. They sense that the wind is now in their sails. They've had a strategy that has worked well for them, as Podolyak, by the way, all but admitted, and as Budanov has also done. And there's no reason for the moment to change it. So that's the military side of things. In terms of the diplomatic side, we've now had reports in both Reuters and in the New York Times, which essentially admit that Western support for Ukraine is now beginning to fade away. The New York Times put it best. They said that support for Ukraine has peaked, that the Western governments have been dismayed. It's perhaps putting it more strongly than the New York Times does, but I don't think this is an overstatement, that Western governments have been dismayed by the failure of Ukraine's offensive, that they were not expecting or preparing for a long war, that they do not have the means or the resources to wage a long war, and they know that their publics, who are becoming increasingly disillusioned and increasingly concerned about mounting economic problems at home, are in no mood either to support Ukraine through a long war. And that from this moment on, support for Ukraine is going to start to fade. And it's generally conceded that whatever happens ultimately in the US Congress, whoever is elected Speaker in the Congress, whether it is Jim Jordan, which I think is a possibility, but then I'm not an expert in these kind of things, in internal Republican politics, but whoever it is who is elected, the days of massive American largesse for Ukraine are probably behind us. The cupboard is now bare, and as Brian Beletic discussed in his last program on the new Atlas, the United States now finds itself in a situation where it has to support two allies or proxies in two wars, Israel and Ukraine. And in such a conflict, well, it's hardly a choice. Ultimately, it's going to support Israel ahead of Ukraine. even whilst the United States has to continue to prepare for this giant conflict with China, which many still see as being there just over the horizon. So all of that leaves Ukraine in an extremely difficult position. There's more criticism of Ukraine now from various people in the West. There's more statements about its corruption. And I get the sense that Ukraine is becoming increasingly yesterday's story. It's been overtaken by events elsewhere in the world, as sooner or later it was bound to be. Now, if that does indeed happen, if support for Ukraine from the West does dwindle away, and I don't know of anybody seriously who supposes otherwise, then this defeat of Ukraine, which is already emerging and developing, is going to become inevitable. It is going to be a case of the Russians deciding how far the war will go and dictating its outcome, because Ukraine cannot by itself resist Russia, and the West is no longer in a position to support Ukraine to resist Russia. But I'm afraid that no one should make the mistake of thinking that the fact that Ukraine's fate looks like it's sealed is going to result in any diplomatic initiative, either from Ukraine or from the West, to end the war. In the case of Ukraine, I've already discussed how, in my opinion, the dominant actors within the political scene in Kiev, people like Budanov, would prefer an outright defeat to a compromise which leaves a Ukrainian rump state denuded of its great industrial regions and its southern ports, and ultimately subject to Moscow. I think that for Budanov, that would be such a compromise on his conception of what Ukraine should be, that he will oppose that in every conceivable way he can. And I think that there are lots of people in the Ukrainian power structure, what's left of it, who will agree with him. And in the West, I also have to say that I think that compromise with the Russians over the future of Ukraine is impossible, because no Western official, no Western government, and certainly no American official, and certainly not this administration or any administration likely to succeed it, would be prepared to negotiate with the Russians, not just on the issue of Ukraine, but on the larger security situation in Europe, in a way that the Russians would insist as part of a settlement of the crisis in Ukraine. So I'm afraid, and I say this with no joy, that this war will grind on, despite the fact that the outcome is now clear. The Russians will eventually win, and they will dictate terms, and it could be, as the Speaker of the Duma, the Russian Parliament, Vyacheslav Volodin, said, that the outcome will be the end of Ukraine as a state. And personally, I would not be surprised if we saw some kind of partition arrangement in which the Russians take control of all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper, Ukraine's coastline, including Odessa, Nikolaev, Izmail, all of these places famous from Russian history, from the wars of Catherine the Great and Potemkin and Suvorov, and perhaps also central Ukraine, conceivably even Kiev as well, and that the Russians, in order to perhaps resolve some of their problems on their western borders and to win potential friends in Eastern Europe, agree some kind of partition arrangement with some of the East European countries, Romania, Poland, and Hungary, all of which have potential irredentist claims over parts of Ukraine. Well, what Ukraine would be left, whether there would even be a statelet in Western Ukraine, we'll have to wait and see. But I cannot avoid the conclusion that we are now starting to see very much the end of the affair where Ukraine is concerned, and that the ultimate decisions as to what happens in the end will now be decided in Moscow. Well, that is where I end my programme for today. We still remain in the grip of momentous events. We will see how they go. It's far from certain, by the way, which direction this crisis is going to take. But anyway, I've expressed my views. I've done so sincerely and clearly. You don't have to agree on some of the things that I have said. But anyway, since I'm commenting about these events, it seems to me that it's only proper for me to do so. Thank you for joining me again today. Let me remind you once more, you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to go to our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.